Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this new webinar of the Middle East Institute of the National University of Singapore. It's a pleasure to host this event. I'm Jean-Luc Saman, Senior Research Fellow at the Institute, and I'll be the host for the next hour and a half. Today, we will be talking about a new geopolitical concept that has been, for the past 5 years, at the forefront of many discussions among governments and think tanks around the world, the Indo-Pacific. In its simplest understanding, the Indo-Pacific represents the merger of two political regions, Asia-Pacific and the Indian Ocean. But when we dig deeper, many other aspects of that concept start emerging. First, the Indo-Pacific is about a strategic triangle, one that includes China, the US, and India, and the relations between these three major powers across this broad region of the Indo-Pacific. Second, the Indo-Pacific is also about many other countries, such as Japan, South Korea, or Indonesia, that are of strategic significance for the regional order. Third, the Indo-Pacific concept, this concept, comes along with the political narrative that portrays great power competition as a bipolar competition or as a zero-sum game. In other words, either you are with the US or you are with China. And this is a conundrum way too familiar, in a sense, historically for Southeast Asia, in particular for Singapore, that has always maintained a careful balance between major powers. But as we will see today, this new Indo-Pacific concept has consequences with regions which are less familiar with the game of balancing. The Middle East, and more specifically Gulf states as well as Israel, may not look like the natural countries to include in this Indo-Pacific arena. But as evidenced by the recent tensions between Washington and some of its Gulf partners over their increasing ties with China, the Indo-Pacific has landed in the Middle East as well. And it will force those countries to integrate this development into their foreign policies. In that context, we are delighted at the Middle East Institute to discuss today all these critical questions and others, and to unpack the idea of the Indo-Pacific with the two editors of a coming new book published by Routledge entitled Indo-Pacific Strategies Navigating Geopolitics at the Dawn of a New Age, Brendan Cannon and Kay Hakata. Brendan Cannon is an assistant professor of international security at Khalifa University in Abu Dhabi in the UAE. His research is at the nexus of international relations, security studies, and geopolitics. Is among different publications the co-editor of Conflict and Cooperation in the Indo-Pacific, already published by Routledge in 2020. Kei Hakata is a professor at Seikei University in Japan. He specializes in international politics and security affairs in the Indo-Pacific. Previously worked for the Japanese Ministry of Foreign Affairs, where he dealt with Africa and official development assistance. Brendan and Kay are joined as well by one of the authors of the chapters in the book, Ash Rossiter. Ash is an assistant professor of international security at Khalifa University. He received his PhD from the University of Exeter in 2014 and is the author, among other publications, of Security in the Gulf, which was published by Cambridge University Press in 2020. I will now, without further ado, leave the floor to our speakers. We will start with Brendan Cannon. Floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Jean-Luc, for having us here today. First, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are, good morning. Well, it's afternoon here in the UAE, but for those of you further west, good morning. Thanks to the organizers of this event. It's a real honor and pleasure for us to be here. I'd like to thank the National University of Singapore in general, but the Middle East Institute at the National University of Singapore in particular for this, and also to Sharon for her logistical efforts on our behalf, and of course to my good friend and colleague, Dr. Jean-Luc Simon. So thank you very much. My only regret is that we are still online rather than in person, but hopefully we're getting to the tail end of this COVID-19 pandemic, and it will allow us to begin to do things in person again. Now I'm going to share my screen, which I should have attempted to do a bit earlier, but let me do that now. And I'll see if I can get a full screen for everybody here. One moment. Okay, hopefully that's working for everybody. I'm going to begin with a photo here. This is a photo taken in October of 2020. It was taken in Tokyo when the foreign ministers of India, Japan, Australia, and the United States met in person. This was at the height of the COVID-19 pandemic. And what's interesting about this is that they met in person really when none of us were flying anywhere at the time. So that they would do so says a lot about this hardening rivalry between the United States and the People's Republic of China that Jean-Luc referenced earlier. In most circles, this so-called competition is taken as a given. And many will agree that the theater of this competition is something known as the Indo-Pacific. So this is one of the geopolitical maps that Kay and I had made specifically for our book. Obviously, it's the world upside down, but we think this is pretty important to give everyone just the size and scope of this maritime arena we're dealing with, the vast amount of water that is the Pacific Ocean, the Indian Ocean, as well as the Southern Oceans that runs north of Antarctica there. So the region is vast, it's maritime, and it defies control in a way that the terrestrial world does not. That's an important point here. And of course, this is where China, the US, and other major powers attempt to spread influence, or conversely to see it diminished. Many states continue to support what's known as the rules-based order, something that was bequeathed from the post-World War II order. This thus has been around over 75 years. And in this, there's these attempts by China seemingly to disrupt and revise it. And this is casting doubt on its sustainability. So this challenge is most salient in the Indo-Pacific, which also happens to be the location of the world's most populous states, both China and India, and where global wealth is progressively being concentrated. It hosts the political and economic powerhouses of the US, China, Japan, and India, as well as those of Singapore, Vietnam, South Korea, and Australia, as Jean-Luc mentioned earlier. Now, further enhancing this geostrategic importance of the Indo-Pacific is that it embraces Eastern Africa and the Middle East. Okay, and the map you should see on, I believe, your left is another map that Kay and I had made showing the Western Indian Ocean region, and importantly, Eastern Africa, the region stretching from really Eritrea south into Mozambique, as well as the Arabian Peninsula, which is the primary exporter of hydrocarbons to, of course, South and East Asia. Okay, the topic of the Middle East is something that our host, Dr. Jean-Luc, is an expert on. And I'm pleased to say that he actually contributed a chapter to our book on the limits of strategic hedging of Arab Gulf states in the Indo-Pacific. So it's a very prescient topic as well. Now, as importantly, the Indian Ocean is where the world's major sea lines of communication, or SLOCs, lie. And as I've mentioned, the share of hydrocarbon and other shipments that go across the Indian Ocean, which are so critical to economies like Singapore's, China's, and Japan's. So taken together, the Indo-Pacific enjoys a prominence that's expected to last far into the future. Even with foreseeable shifts in energy and industry, that's not going to affect its salience, is the findings of Kay and I. On the contrary, this range of regional actors, new and old, will accompany a revival of a historic pattern in which China and India dominated almost half of the world's wealth. Now, because geopolitical challenges are proliferating, the Indo-Pacific as a geostrategic idea has gained saliency in the international arena of states, foremost among middle powers, by the way. as they've attempted to hedge, balance or bandwagon with these challenges. And so in the face of major shifts in the distribution of power, the Indo-Pacific is thus posited as a tool to attenuate the risks and to preserve the geopolitical status quo in the face of a sustained revisionism by China. All right, over the course of the past decade, the Indo-Pacific concept, far from being ephemeral sea foam, as Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi opined in 2018, has come to provide the quartet of Japan, India, Australia, and the United States with a solid geostrategic perspective, a hook on which to hang geopolitically inspired policies and strategies that address the globe's foremost challenges. Beyond mapping the strategic competition and spelling out strategic thoughts, the Indo-Pacific organically fosters the free and open virtues underpinning this rules-based order I mentioned earlier. The idea, however, is hollow without its implementing architecture. And this is where the Quad, or the quadrilateral security dialogue, comes in. It acts as a mutually constituted force driving the Indo-Pacific concept and concretizing it through specific policies, as well as summits like you see here, the one in Washington, D.C. that was happened, I believe, last year. Okay. So the Quad was initiated by Japan's Prime Minister Shinzo Abe back in 2007. But it took on new urgency on account of Chinese brinksmanship in 2017. And thus the current Quad, as we see it, is the specific outcome of strategic thinking about the Indo-Pacific, as well as China, in and among the concerned capitals. Since 2017, for instance, the four governments have held regular consultations at ever higher levels to include now regular joint leaders meetings, as well as the issuance of joint leaders statements. They've already met in March of this year. They're going to meet again at the end of May. So if anything, the impetus for and tempo of the Quad has increased exponentially over the last few years. And so it was to explain, analyze, and quantify the Indo-Pacific, along with its implementing architecture, the Quad, that Kay and I developed and produced our new book, Indo-Pacific Strategies, the cover of which you see here. Now, Kay and I began discussing this possibility over 4 years ago when I was a visiting scholar at Kay's university, Seikei University in Tokyo. 4 years later, our book is almost out. It should be available within the next few weeks. It has 12 chapters published, written by 11 international scholars, people from France, from Singapore, from Japan, from India, from the UAE, from Australia, et cetera, as well as Taiwan, by the way. So we set out to explore the opportunities and conundrums faced by various states and regions in first, their relationship with the Indo-Pacific proponent states, and second, their relationship with China. What we found is that in general terms is the Indo-Pacific undeniably espouses overlapping concerns and exposes blurred conceptual contours. The proponent Indo-Pacific states have different strategic interests and geographical scopes, even when referring to the same terminology. And as my colleague who's here with me today, Ash Rossiter, and I pointed out back in 2018, the Indo-Pacific means and will mean different things to different people. Rather than being a weakness, however, as many scholars have concluded, Kay and I, and Ash and I, see the fact that the Quad states have not come up with unitary policies in no way discredits the value of the Indo-Pacific. Rather, if the concept appears confusing, it's because it originated from a group of democratic states articulating their diverse visions. This inevitably leads to a lively round table. Contrary to China's Belt and Road Initiative, which has been promoted by an authoritarian government capable of expressing a unitary vision, the Indo-Pacific itself is free and open as a concept. It thus naturally lacks an authoritative interpretation. So is there an ultimate aim inherent in the Indo-Pacific policies of the Quad? There certainly seems to be the silent intention to counter China. There's no doubt about that. Its ultimate objective, nonetheless, as Kay and I see it after editing this book, may be to create a principled regionalism across the Indo-Pacific, a regionalism that is free from coercion and predation. Despite a host of detractors, the Quad already plays a collective role in safeguarding the rules-based international order, while the Indo-Pacific, one that is, quote, free and open, end quote, in the words of former Prime Minister Abe, exerts an inspirational power. I'm going to end my comments, my introductory comments there. Thank you very much, everybody, for listening to them. I'm going to turn it over now to my dear friend and co-editor, Kei Hakata, for his comments, and I'll stop sharing my screen as well.
Right. I'm honored to speak at this event today. I thank Dr. Saman and the organizers for the invitation. After Brendan's opening remark, I would like to touch on the rest of chapter 1 I jointly wrote with Brendan. This is about Eurasia as a parallel agenda of the Indo-Pacific. Brendan and I observed that this important geopolitical regional concept of Eurasia is strikingly absent in the Indo-Pacific debate, and we wish to shed a light on this absence and also the consequences of ignoring this region. The Indo-Pacific concept is certainly a wide-ranging concept that sees a large maritime area spanning the two oceans as a single geographical and, for some, strategic space. However, there are arguably areas and spaces which were eclipsed in the Indo-Pacific discourse. For example, we can cite global governance as represented by the United Nations, which doesn't appear in this discussion, yet highly focused in Chinese diplomacy. Indeed, the Indo-Pacific is by no means global in its geographical scope. It is purpose-oriented, and we must acknowledge its limited nature. However, the absence of Eurasia is striking, and its conceptual positioning remains unclear. So Brendan and I believe that this oversight should not be emulated, at least in our book. In relation to the Indo-Pacific, Eurasia is geographically contiguous and strategically connected. Geographically, the Indo-Pacific and Eurasia are twins. The Indo-Pacific is a maritime counterpart of Eurasia. While this interconnectedness seems obvious to many, it doesn't appear clearly in the Indo-Pacific strategies so far. Eurasia is conspicuously missing from the Indo-Pacific discussion. As such, it seems to relativize the strategic importance of what is called the world's geopolitical chessboard. From such a perspective, our book attempted to clarify the location of Eurasia in the Indo-Pacific debate. From that viewpoint, we requested several authors to write on these issues in the respective chapters. So this is another map, geopolitical maps I and Brendan have crafted for the purpose of this book. And this one is a new one Brendan and I crafted for the Japanese edition of the Indo-Pacific strategies, which will appear later this year. And if you see this map, Indo-Pacific is just alongside the Eurasia, and you see clearly the connection between the two geographical notions. And in this regard, we should refer to classical geopolitics, especially in its early days, which tended to focus on the Eurasian heartland. And I believe Ash will explain it in depth later on. So I will just briefly touch on it. The Indo-Pacific of today was just a periphery or rim of Eurasia at the time when classical or geopolitics discussed Eurasia in relation to great competition between Britain, Russia, and Germany. But that periphery or rim is now on the spotlight. So how should we understand the conceptual positioning of Eurasia in the Indo-Pacific concept? Even if the word Eurasia doesn't appear in the ongoing Indo-Pacific debate, we understand it's implicitly on the agenda. The same is true for the term Asia, which of course do not appear in the term Indo-Pacific. Although implicit, the Indo-Pacific is part of maritime Eurasia, or it overlaps with a maritime Asia. In addition, it has strategic implications. While no sensible government official would declare or approve, the Indo-Pacific strategy is about China and about this growing hegemony in Eastern Eurasia. In this sense, Indo-Pacific strategies are kind of Eurasian strategy conducted from the two oceans, if not from the backdoor to counter a risen China. Admittedly, the ongoing Indo-Pacific strategies are focused on Eurasia around its maritime rim. The terrestrial component is absent. The contrast is stark if we compare them to China's hybrid Belt and Road Initiative. While the Belt and Road Initiative keeps its enigmatic nature with a web of numerous routes and new initiatives, it has a broad strategy to shape Eurasia and beyond by a terrestrial belt and maritime route. China has its own Indo-Pacific policy called the Maritime Silk Road, but the Quad countries do not have an equivalent of the Silk Road economic belt. Our book is not about Eurasia per se. However, while examining the Indo-Pacific policies of various states, we called for further intellectual and policy attention to Eurasia. This is an urgent issue as Pax Seneca appears to be expanding rapidly from Eastern Eurasia. As I argued in the Japanese edition of our book, it is more so after this year's Ukrainian war. It appears that China's growing hegemony in Eastern Eurasia has become more pronounced as Russia becomes a political loser of this war. Russian President Vladimir Putin once wanted to lead a greater Eurasia, but unlike Putin's geopolitical aspirations, China appears to be taking control of greater Eurasia with Russia as its junior partner. Relatedly, we must be aware of Russia's Indo-Pacific strategy, as Russia is now cut off from Europe and it looks to India and Asia Pacific for further partnership. All this make Eurasia an important geopolitical arena along with the Indo-Pacific. By examining this parallel agenda, I believe our book has made an enormous intellectual contribution to the ongoing debate on the Indo-Pacific strategies. So thank you very much.
And now we'll turn to Ash for his chapter.
Okay, thanks, Jean-Luc. I'm just going to share the screen, and hopefully that will work. Here we go. How does that look? Okay, great. Well, greetings from Abu Dhabi. Along with Brendan, I'd normally share an office next to him, but I thought we would crowd each other out by talking through the very, very thin walls we have at Khalifa University. But very, 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 very pleased to be talking about this, as Kay described, this intellectual contribution. And I agree, not because I'm an author in the book, but I very much was a supporter of the ideas behind the book, and was delighted when I was invited to make a contribution. And one of the, I would say, scene-setting chapters. In fact, I think along with Kay and Brendan's introductory chapter it is a scene-setting chapter which I relished tackling. Although I would say the focus very much of my chapter is on exploring some of the connections between geopolitics as a theoretical tradition and the extent to which they exist within emerging Indo-Pacific strategies. I'll add on a little bit and say that I've spent quite a bit of time in the Middle East, both in a academic capacity and before that in a government and other professional capacities as well, although my knowledge is not as extensive as Jean-Lou's. When we get to question time, I'm happy to have a stab at any questions related to the Indo-Pacific strategies and how this book might speak to the Middle East. I know that's probably an emphasis that your institute would be interested in as well. But let me move on. I think I've got about 15 minutes and some slides and some words on slides, which betrays a rule of mine to leave off as many words as possible off slides, but I have got some, so bear with me slightly, and we'll try and keep it within 15 minutes. Right, so the premise behind my chapter, and these are not all my own original thoughts. I would say, though my name is attached to this chapter, it was more of felt like a collaborative effort with the editors as well. I mean, particularly Professor Hakata has a deep interest in geopolitics as a theoretical tradition. So it was an exciting work in progress, actually. But the starting point of this is that it's increasingly clear that commentary about the Indo-Pacific is redolent, is infused with some of the language of earlier 20th century analytical terms, particularly those attached with geopolitics, as set out by some of its founding thinkers, whether it's Mahan, Mackinder, and their intellectual successor, Nicholas Spikeman as well, coming in around the Second World War. These ideas, as I say, have become unfashionable, but their combined way of thinking is certainly creeping in, if not infusing, a lot of the language being used about the Indo-Pacific. And I would make the argument you can increasingly find this theoretical tradition sneaking into policy documents. And I do a brief survey of Japan, the United States, and China, which doesn't have an Indo-Pacific strategy, but has, as Professor Hakata was talking about then, has other policies or strategies that clearly are Indo-Pacific all in name, but maybe more of a Eurasian Indo-Pacific strategy. So certainly the emphasis on this interplay between geography and also evolving technology, but the importance placed in geography is central to understanding how Indo-Pacific strategies are being thought about and developed. This special attention geopolitics gives to the geographical differences between great powers, in particular, is something that I think is crucial. And geopolitics is often conflated with realism, but I think this special emphasis on the geographical differences between great powers, where they sit, their geographical realities, may seem an obvious thing to say, but often not thought about enough analytically, is really important. So differences between land powers, sea powers, and land-sea hybrid powers in particular is a crucial analytical lens through which to look at the Indo-Pacific. And I'll develop that thought a bit further. So the chapter essentially makes that argument that this emphasis between geographical differences and of the unit types is very, very useful when it comes to thinking about the Indo-Pacific. So it investigates if geopolitics, so it goes a bit further than that, because this is both attempting to be something of an academic enterprise, this chapter, but also make the try and make the link between academic theory and actual real policy, which is often a bridge too far. But I attempt to make some tentative, very, very tentative links between those two things. So academic theory and the way we can find theoretical thought infusing actual real policy and strategy. But again, as I say, very, 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 very tentative. I'm not trying to make any concrete or definite or definitive statements about how policy and strategies is directly informed by, say, geopolitical thinking of Spikeman, Mackinder, and Mahan. But there's clearly something going on here where these ideas appear and increasingly prevalent in statements and policy documents about the Indo-Pacific. So that's what it investigates and looks at three great powers in the Indo-Pacific: China, Japan, and the US. In many respects, there's nothing surprising why we would see a resurgence, a renaissance in the use of the word, in particular, geopolitics, used in the context of heightened competition in the Indo-Pacific. This is primarily, I would argue, because geopolitics is conflated with realism. For most commentators, it's just swapped between sort of realist thought and geopolitics. The emphasis being in both, in the common use of the word geopolitics, is emphasis on resource capture and the zero-sum logics of competition. So all about power, right? But geopolitics has its own unique things, I would argue, to say about the Indo-Pacific, especially about the differences in the challenges and obstacles and policy prescriptions facing the different units, primarily because of their geographical realities. I would also say a really important contribution geopolitics can make is that it's, from a policy prescription point of view, is that it speaks about how to manage the balance of power. It doesn't treat it as an external reality that can't be shaped, but has policy prescriptions for the different geographical units about what they could, or even maybe should do in certain circumstances. And the biggest circumstance here is the emergence of an aspirant Eurasian hegemon, at least seen through the eyes of the United States and Japan and others. So that's the reality that they have to develop strategies to confront, maybe too strong a word, but take it for that. Because geopolitics has a predictive and prescriptive quality about what might come to pass, it has already been used, arguably, and people have drawn, for example, links between geopolitics and the way, say, Henry Kissinger thought about and developed US grand strategy in the 1960s and 1970s, as practiced by different government strategists. Henry Kissinger is not the only one, but perhaps one of the most prominent proponents of a geopolitical outlook on the world. It's employed academic theories, but geopolitics is quite a digestible and simple theoretical toolbox as a heuristic guide for anticipating future geopolitical trajectories. So part of its attractiveness, I would argue, for policymakers is that it can be simplified, sometimes too reductionist. It loses some of its specific contributions when it's reduced, say, down to a simple understanding of power politics, and the geographical emphasis is diluted from it, and then it loses, I would argue, some of its policy prescription utility. But nevertheless, I think as a heuristic device, it's very, very useful. So the chapter goes on to ask, how far are the grand strategies of geographically different Indo-Pacific great power units. So the states, and I pick three, as I mentioned, Japan, the United States, and China, infused with this geopolitical outlook. Right, so it's setting out quite a big task to do, and I'm not suggesting that I reach definitive conclusions on this. It's more of an exploration of whether these ideas can be somewhat found within the grand strategies of these units as they relate to the Indo-Pacific. So I'll run through the next 5 minutes. I'll just run through a very brief summary of what the types of things that can be found from a geopolitical outlook within the strategies of the United States, Japan, and China. The chapter has a lot more to say on this, but as time constraints, I'll just do a very quick run through. Within the US Indo-Pacific strategy, and I should say that Japan and the US differ from China in terms of the visibility of at least what seems to be official thinking is within successive administrations and their wider foreign policy making bureaucracies through the publication of documents that set out to their respective populations what the country is doing, will do, and how it perceives the world. So there's a slight challenge and a clear difference in the ability to find out what's happening in the minds of at least officialdom within these three short cases. But anyway, the United States has issued quite a few policy documents on the Indo-Pacific, some by the Department of Defense, some by the State Department, and it's dipping into those. It was the attempt in this chapter is to pull out some of the ideas that seem to be infused with a geopolitical outlook. US Indo-Pacific strategy clearly hinges on the freedom of movement in the global commons. This is a constant feature throughout most of the policy documents, especially the seas. So the global commons that provide access to much of the globe. This is no surprise. We look at each of the three cases is coupled up with a term either developed by Mackinder or Spikeman. So the United States is the dominant maritime power in the world, and there are certain prescriptions that come out from geopolitical thinkers about what a dominant maritime power should do. No surprise, it should be. Its position hinges on access to the global commons, particularly the seas. Also, dovetailing with geopolitical thinking, there are references to the disadvantages of a hegemon emerging in East Asia, I mean, in particular on the Eurasian landmass, and what that would eventually mean for access to the global commons, the seas. So this is classic geopolitical thinking. The geopolitical prescription differs somewhat between classic geopolitical thinkers, particularly Mahan, Spikeman, and Mackinder, on what should be done about that, though there's a reasonably broad consensus amongst them that the key, therefore, is to balance China through maintaining a continental commitment. That continental commitment is very much a loaded term. To what extent should the US be able to, as the dominant maritime power, intervene or have commitments where it can shape and manage the balance of power on the Eurasian landmass? But that's the prescription anyway. That's what a dominant maritime power should do. But interesting, the term Indo-Pacific, and this speaks to something that Kay was talking about earlier, unlike Asia-Pacific, skips by the Asian landmass in the name. Right? It's two oceans, and replaces it with two oceans. So containment by dominating the two oceans surrounding China seems to be the prescription that comes out of recent policy documents. And of course, as many of you would know very, very well, one of the biggest foreign policy debates in the United States is this idea of the continental commitment. How much what should a US forward military presence look like in East Asia? Or how much should it be about dominating the two oceans? How much can the US realistically influence on the Eurasian landmass? So that's the question left very much unanswered by this chapter. The Insular Sea Power, the second case, Japan, is an outer crescent sea power. As it's less threatened, again, this is me pulling out some geopolitical ideas and seeing how much they land with these cases. Japan is an outer crescent sea power, is less threatened by the distant dominant maritime power, the United States, than the emerging hegemon in the rimland, whose hybrid nature, so China being both a land sea power, it's both looks inwards to the Eurasian landmass, but outwards to the seas as well. So it's a hybrid power, makes it both a continental power and increasingly a naval power in its adjacent waters. So unthreatened by the United States because of the distance and the fact the United States is a maritime power, means that Japan naturally allies with the United States, and that would be the policy prescription for an insular sea power as thought about by geopolitical thinkers, past and present. Interestingly, though, and this is a key idea that comes out in the chapter, that you see within Japanese foreign policy statements and documents, is that to contain what it sees as a potential aspirant, although it would probably not use the word contain, but nevertheless, to contain a country prone to dominate Eurasia, the outer crescent insular sea power should cooperate with like-minded democracies. This is a very, very key theme that comes out within Japanese foreign policy statements about the Indo-Pacific, that it's about linking up with like-minded democracies. So there's a unique admixture of realism and idealism inherent in Japanese strategic thought when it comes to the Indo-Pacific. And of course, the economic agenda of a maritime strategy that Japan must have cannot be decoupled from security concerns for trading nations like Japan that depend on open sea lanes. So that dovetails also with the dominant maritime powers strategy about maintaining openness in the global commons. That naturally links across to what Japan wants to see as well. China, as I mentioned, policy statements and strategies are harder to investigate in some respects because of the opacity of strategic thinking in China, but not impossible to make inferences from what it's actually doing and statements here and there from its foreign policy community and the CCP as well. Whatever the CCP or China thinks, China's BRI, Belt Road Initiative, very much seen outside of China through a geopolitical lens. And I'll talk about more about that in just a moment. This idea of Mackinder's heartland, this is linked. These ideas then become linked. Whether Chinese officials have ever heard of Mackinder, but if the extent to which his writings and thinkings infuse China's foreign policy and strategy cannot be investigated properly, but certainly there's a match between what seems to be Mackinder's heartland theory of a hegemon emerging within Eurasia, unified in particular by transportation, seems for many to be clearly linked to the BRI, and more particularly the Silk Road economic belt as well. So Silk Road economic belt as well as the Maritime Silk Road, are seen as, in effect, Indo-Pacific strategies with a Eurasian, with a typical not a typical, but what you would expect from a hybrid power, thinking about the Indo-Pacific or the seas around it, but also inland as well. So it's you could make inferences from these two strategies of a dual-facing, or what you would expect to see from a dual-facing aspirant hegemon. So that's it. That's what the chapter's about, and there's more analysis and detail in those in the chapter itself. So I encourage you to buy the book. The book's a very good book when it comes out. So the final remarks on this are Indo-Pacific strategies seem to be inspired by geopolitical realities as well as theoretical presuppositions. Right? But I don't think we can reduce that down to the geopolitics as a theoretical tradition, which I discuss in my chapter. Seems to be at the moment more of a confused admixture of classical geopolitics, liberalism, and constructivism as well, to throw in a few more IR terms. Nevertheless, public statements about grand strategy are increasingly tinged, flavored, colored with realism, and I would argue the overriding importance of geographical factors, which speaks to the increasing relevance of classical geopolitics as a theoretical tradition in informing many of these states as they approach the Indo-Pacific. That's my final remark on that. So I can't remember who I'm handing over to next, Jean-Luc, but whoever it is, I'll leave that up to you, and I'll turn off my microphone.
Thank you very much, Ash. I believe Brendan and Kay actually wanted to wrap up on the presentation of the book, right?
Kay's next, I believe.
Shall I go?
Yes.
Okay. Right. So I wrote another chapter, which is chapter 5, and let me share the slide. Yes. So this is a chapter in which I dealt with Japan's Indo-Pacific strategy, and Ash explained quite rightly that it is a admixture of classical geopolitics, liberalism, and constructivism. And in this regard, I must say that ideas mattered, and so did people like the policymakers and the politicians. So this is the textbook example of what Ash examined in his chapter. So my chapter is about Japan, and I detail in several sections. And today, I only touch upon the two first sections briefly. Japan, some of you may have visited Japan already. Japan is a country surrounded by the sea on all sides, which naturally conditions Japan's diplomacy, security, and geoeconomy. Japan is a long diagonal archipelago, and it has one of the largest exclusive economic zones in the world. So it greatly benefits from the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. And Japan has a lot of interest and stake in keeping these fundamental values of international law untouched. So Japan is surrounded by the sea. As such, the sea has become a natural fortress to protect Japan from foreign invasion and influence. The downside of its geography is that it requires considerable national defense and coast guard capabilities to protect vast areas. In particular, the deployment of troops to the Nansei Islands in the south is a major issue, as it is increasingly challenged by Chinese assertiveness around that region. Japan finds itself in a geopolitically challenging region it is surrounded by Russia, China, and North Korea. But many of foreign commentators tend to omit South Korea is also a challenge for Japan as it engages in anti-Japan political warfare constantly. So we have to be vigilant vis-a-vis these four neighbors around Japan. In a sense, Japan is a solitary island state in Northeast Asia. Now there is an increasing debate here in Japan to compare Ukraine to Japan, not to Taiwan. So there is a growing sense of vulnerability since a couple of months about the security of Japan. And you see the great change right now about how people perceive Japan's security. Increasing people support the 2% of GDP expenditure for defense, which wasn't imaginable a couple of months ago. So there is a great feeling of vulnerability, but also a great sense of the need for vamping up its defense. But anyway, it's a maritime trading nation. So the challenge for Japan is to protect the sea lines of communications around Japan and also far from Japan in the South China Sea. But as you all know, it is increasingly threatened by China's assertive activities. So Japan's security environment has deteriorated, but because of this, Japan has been endeavoring to create a favorable international environment for its survival. Among the prime examples are the Indo-Pacific Initiative and the quadrilateral consultation, as our book demonstrates. The administration of former Prime Minister Abe created and advanced these foreign policy ideas and tools. Clearly, the free and open Indo-Pacific FOIP is one of the achievements of Abe's diplomacy. It was launched by Abe at the Tokyo International Conference on African Development held in Nairobi, August 2016. Since then, it has been adopted not only by Japan, but also by the United States, Australia, and indeed India with some variations. And it is the 2016 Nairobi speech that Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Japan officially positions the launch of FOIP vision. And this is quite important when we think about the policy formulation among the different ministries. I don't go into detail today. What is important is that in that speech, Prime Minister Shinzo Abe outlined what Japan's free and open Indo-Pacific vision means. It aims at maintaining a rules-based order in a vast maritime region. Importantly, Prime Minister Abe emphasized free and open. In a private conversation with me, he confessed that this qualifier of free and open is important and it must be kept intact. That's what he told me. In Brandon and my understanding, this is not what Abe said, but it's our understanding that freedom and openness means the denial of coercion and predation once exercised by China. Speaking of Abe, he wrote the following statement in forward. It is a strong statement coming from the former Prime Minister of Japan, and it articulates the philosophical foundation of the free and open Indo-Pacific. And we highly value his kindness to offer his words, kind words for our book. And in it, he says, important public goods for the world and humanity. And here we can see the notion of global commons or maritime commons. So it is evident in Japanese policymakers' idea. So while the official explanation by Morpho positions for its origin to Abe's Nairobi speech, my chapter made clear that a geostrategic thinking existed well before. I explained that Japan's Indo-Pacific approach started with Prime Minister Abe's speech, Conference of the Two Seas, delivered at Indian Parliament in August 2007. It spelled out exactly what the ongoing Indo-Pacific debate has aimed to achieve. When it comes to the quote, Abe himself is the originator of the idea. In a book published in 2006 titled To a Beautiful Country, Abe explained his geostrategic idea. This idea laid the foundation of what later became the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, or usually called the Quad. He didn't name it as such, but people gradually give this name. And lastly, I mentioned one of the problems with FOIP, which is a special scope. The Indo-Pacific concept is far from global in its scope. Indeed, FOIP has the potential to implement a wide range of policy issues. However, unlike Belt and Road Initiative of Beijing, FOIP has specific geographical boundaries. Therefore, FOIP has a challenge in policy expansion geographically. Looking to the future, my chapter argued that Japan and other key Indo-Pacific countries may eventually have to create an imaginary geographic space accompanied with connectivity, just as China's Belt and Road is, but one that is capable of transmitting the essential values of FOIP. I believe this short presentation gave you a rough idea of my Japan chapter. Thank you very much.
Jean-Luc, I've got the final presentation. I'll try to wrap it up quickly because I know we want to have time for some questions. So let me share my screen again quickly, and I'll try to see here. Okay, my chapter, along with the introductory chapter I wrote with Kay, is chapter 12, the final chapter in the book. And in this, I focus on a region I'm quite familiar with, Eastern Africa, which I mentioned in my previous comments. This brings the topic and the comments and our comments closer to the Middle East, which has increasing ties to states like Ethiopia, Djibouti, Somalia, Kenya, etc. And so the purpose of having a chapter on Eastern Africa is to first situate the role of that vast region within the Indo-Pacific. Second, it's to explore the political economy of East Africa's engagement with external states like China and Japan. Third, it's to briefly document the rise and role of China itself in the region, and in turn contrast this with the role of the Quad states in general, but with Japan in particular. And then finally, I contextualize Eastern Africa's rising importance to the Indo-Pacific and offer some prescriptive analysis as to the various paths Quad states may take in relation to the region. Now, it's a curious subject and one that rarely features in books or articles about the Indo-Pacific to date. There's lots of articles on Japan's nearly 60-year engagement with the region. There's thousands of articles now on China and its Belt and Road Initiative in sub-Saharan Africa as well as elsewhere in the world. But what are lacking are attempts to contextualize Eastern Africa's political and business leaders. Sorry, what's lacking are efforts to contextualize the actions of Eastern Africa's political and business leaders in what is increasingly a tussle for influence in places like Kenya, Mauritius, and Ethiopia. The chapter crucially contains some survey work I performed in Kenya, along with a Japanese scholar and a Kenyan scholar back in 2020 at the height of the COVID-19 pandemic, that attempted to measure Kenyans' changing attitudes towards China since 2015. In addition, comparisons of exactly what states like Japan are doing as compared to the role of China in the region are nearly non-existent. The two usually are separate from one another. And so as such, I hope that this chapter, along with the other chapters you've heard about, fill critical gaps in the literature of the Indo-Pacific. So very briefly, what are my findings? Look, to date, none of the Quad members share the same urgency to move labor or invest in infrastructure overseas, let alone on the scale of China. Post-COVID-19, the rationale for making such moves is possibly even more foolhardy than it was before. Indeed, the current concerns about Chinese influence and power informing Indo-Pacific policies in Tokyo, Washington, and elsewhere may dissipate vis-a-vis Eastern Africa, and even if they do not, will certainly shift as the world moves on after the pandemic and is forced to adjust its priorities accordingly, as we're already seeing in places like Ukraine, the departure of the US from Afghanistan, et cetera. What's apparent from my research is that reigning perception in Quad capitals about China's surging power and their corresponding losses of influence should not bleed into some scramble for potentially misguided investment in infrastructure far from home. Falling into the costly and ill-informed trap of trying to play catch-up with China using tactics that made little sense outside the unique context China found itself in pre-2019, and they make even less sense now, is surely folly because it takes the focus away from the critical security threats posed by China to states like India and Japan that Kay has mentioned, as well as Ash. Now, to this end, Japan may have actually found a middle way that supports not only Japan's unique national interests in the region, but upholds its influence in Eastern Africa itself. Japanese businesses, for example, continue to make informed investments and money across the Indo-Pacific with the tacit political and financial encouragement of their political leaders. Indeed, a recent article posted in Kenya's respected and influential business daily newspaper had the following headlines, as you can see here. Japan overtakes China in fresh Kenya loan race. China will reportedly reduce investments in Africa by 1/3 in 3 years' time. Per usual, Kenya, as the gateway to East Africa, is already seeing this happen, where China's refused to fund the second leg of Kenya's standard gauge railway that would have run to the border of Uganda. Japan's now overtaken China as Nairobi's top bilateral lender, and this has big implications, not just for Kenya, but all of Eastern Africa, as well as the continent itself. So my findings seem to show what I term a high watermark for China as far as its reputation and influence in places like Kenya. In short, Kenya's leaders seem to hold most of the cards when it comes to dealing with external states as development and financial partners, despite the popular narrative positing the opposite. Proof of this narrative is often looked at as Mombasa Port. Some of you may know, and this is touched on briefly in my book, about rumors that China may assume operations of this major port, East Africa's major port, should Kenya default on its loan for the first leg of the standard gauge railway. I posit that that's an impossibility simply given internal Kenyan politics for reasons of nationalism, et cetera, et cetera. But interestingly, I came across a report that has yet to be published. It will be published very shortly by some other scholars that they did a detailed reading of both Kenyan legal documents and Chinese legal documents relating to the standard gauge railway. And they found that this is not a possibility, and actually that Kenya protected itself very carefully when it came to its negotiations with China to stop any such eventuality from happening. Now, what about the survey results I mentioned? Well, first, Kenyans' attitudes over the first half of 2020 towards China and Chinese trade have seen a downward shift when compared to their attitudes in 2015. Nearly 65% of respondents answered that they felt either somewhat unfavorable or very unfavorable towards China. The top-cited reasons for this included Kenya's debt to China as well as unfair labor practices. Second, China was not viewed as an overtly friendly country by nearly 70% of Kenyan respondents. Third, nearly 90% of Kenyan respondents viewed Chinese projects and China's relationship with Kenya as benefiting only Kenya's political elites as well as their Chinese partners. Lastly, nearly 80% answered no to the question of whether China would make a good security partner for Kenya. And that's in terms of military or counterterrorism efforts, et cetera. So the final answer demonstrates a clear lack of trust in Beijing in security matters and a corresponding desire on the part of Kenyans to engage with multiple states, to include China. This is not a rejection of China by any means. But again, I think there's a hedging of bets here as far as what can be done. And there's also many partners that have come calling, as we say, to Kenya in particular over the past few years. I'll end my comments there and welcome questions on behalf of my fellow panelists about this exciting and highly controversial topic. And of course, Kay's and my major book project, which both Jean-Lu and Ash have contributed to. And we've attempted to bring all these disparate strands under one proverbial roof. I think we've done it with a great deal of success and coherence. And I look forward to hearing your questions and comments. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Brendan, and thank you to the three of you. We have about 20-25 minutes for the Q&A. Let me start right away because I have a few questions which are related to one common topic, which is the impact of the Ukraine war on the Indo-Pacific. I'll start with a first question, which is actually my question, and then we'll move on to more regional questions. The first question is obviously, as you said in each of your presentations, for the last years during the Trump presidency and in the first year of the Biden presidency, there was this idea that the Indo-Pacific was the ultimate priority of the US. Now that we have the Ukraine war and that we have new redeployments of US forces in Europe, it almost sounds like we're back to, let's say, the Cold War in terms of the allocation of resources. How much do you think the ongoing war in Ukraine is going to impact the priority which is assigned to Indo-Pacific, which is, in terms of perception, an important topic? I mean, in Southeast Asia, in Singapore, if you read the opinion pieces, the analysis is actually that this is more or less a diversion, that this is going to distract the US from its initial priority, which is the Indo-Pacific. So how do you see this ongoing conflict affecting the priority given to the Indo-Pacific? Who would like to answer that?
Well, I'll take a first stab.
Shall I go first?
Oh, go ahead, Kay, please.
Okay, yes. I think there are two questions that come to my mind. As Jean-Lu said, prioritization is an important issue that may be affected by the Ukrainian war. But I'm not that much worried about it because China is considered as a systemic competitor by the United States, as long as it is. The policymakers in Washington will prioritize the Indo-Pacific theater along with Western Eurasian theater. But I think there is another maybe more important challenge coming from the cohesion of the Quad members, which is the India factor. As this crisis showed, India has its own policy objectives, which they call a strategic autonomy, and they rightly claim it. And they, that could be a challenge for the cohesion of the Quad. But on this point, I think other Quad members should not bring India in the anti-Russia coalition using the Quad. Instead, 3 other Quad members should explore another architecture such as AUKUS or NATO, try to bring Japan and other Asian countries in that framework. So Quad is again purpose-oriented, and it should be so vis-a-vis Russia or China. So that's my remark. Over to you, Brendan.
I think Ash raised his hand.
Yeah, I don't think that's the done thing, is it, on Zoom? I think there's a button where you can do the raised hand, but you can see me. Yeah, a follow-on line of thinking. I think the question becomes in relation to Indo-Pacific, I think, from thinking about bringing in back in the geopolitical outlook to this question is the extent to which Russia might play a balancing role against China's hegemonic ambitions within the Eurasian landmass, and whether the Ukraine war and the now complete disconnect between Russia and Europe pushes Russia increasingly towards China rather than a balancer to China, becomes a partner of China. But then the important question comes from an Indo-Pacific strategy perspective, is whether Moscow will be content being a junior partner to China. History tells us that it probably doesn't like that idea very much, but that is
I think we lost
the override.
Yeah.
Long-term. In my mind.
We have some connectivity issues with you, Ash. Do you hear us?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yes. Yeah, we lost you in the middle of your answer. Sorry.
Oh, it wasn't a very good answer, but do you want me to repeat the second half of it? I will just add that the big question remains that Russia will, in a geopolitical outlook, the Kinder-esque type prediction will be a balancer to China in the long term, or whether it will be, because of the Ukraine war and the disconnect between Russia now and Europe being complete, whether it will be satisfied as a junior partner to China. And history tells us that that's probably not a position it likes to be in. That's me finished.
Thank you. Brandon, do you want to add something on this topic?
Yeah, very briefly. Look, S. Jaishankar, just yesterday at the Raisina Dialogue, the foreign minister of India, lectured the visiting European Union officials in some respects by reminding them that, look, you keep talking about this seminal moment in world history, but this has been ongoing in Asia for a number of years now, certainly for the past decade. And so I think that in terms of an Indo-Pacific Quad dynamics, while the Ukraine war has shown India to be the odd man out, if you will, I think the foreign minister's comments make it clear that Delhi, Tokyo, Washington, and Canberra are on the same page, that the Indo-Pacific is the theater and that Ukraine happens to be a sideshow. Interestingly enough, in the national newspaper here in the UAE, in Abu Dhabi, this morning, there was an article about how actually, rather than the Ukraine war limiting US involvement in this region, and the Western Indian Ocean and the Gulf, it actually is going to possibly have the effect of increasing it. And so this security conundrum that Japan shares with the Gulf states and many other regions, to include places like Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, and Poland, of whether the U.S. Is it going to be with us when the chips are down? That seems a conflict actually might, like Ukraine, might result in a recommitment, if you will, of the U.S. for its own purposes, but also in concert, at least those purposes dovetail perhaps with allies' interests. I do think there's a normative issue going back to India's stance on the Ukraine war. It was all very well and good of the Indian foreign minister to remind us that things are going on in Asia, that it has a problem on its border with China. But of course, I think the reason Japan and the United States and Australia were uncomfortable with India's stance on Ukraine is simply for that issue of, is this really the way things are supposed to play out? We understand you don't want this happening on your border, but this happens to be another state's border. And look, I think it also showed again some of the systemic and structural weaknesses India suffers from. This isn't so much an attempt to be inclusive. It's an absolute necessity for India to continue to purchase oil and wheat, et cetera, from Russia at this point. And I think that's surfaced as well. And you can spin that any way you want it, but the glass is either half full or half empty when it comes to that. Thanks.
Thank you. Let me follow with two questions. The first one from Clemens Shea, who's a colleague, a research fellow at the Institute. And you mentioned the fact that the Ukraine war is already weakening the cohesion of the Quad regarding India. There's another new regional initiative which is of interest for us here, which is the so-called Middle East Quad, which includes India, Israel, the UAE. And the question is, after the decision of the UAE at the UN Security Council to abstain when there was the initial vote on the war in Ukraine, do you see, as a consequence of this decision, of this some kind of non-alignment of the UAE, do you see this Middle East Quad as something which will not really materialize into something that could support the US agenda, which obviously would be in a way to contain the spread of China's influence in the Middle East and more broadly in the Indo-Pacific? So that's the first question on the, let's say, the consequences of Ukraine for the Middle East Quad. Another question, which is more specifically for Kei here, which is from Alessandro Arduino, who's a principal researcher at the Institute. And Alessandro was reminding me of the fact that Shinzo Abe called for Tokyo to consider hosting US nuclear weapons as a consequence of what's happening in Ukraine. This is even more interesting because Shinzo Abe wrote the foreword of the book. But given these talks, how do you see the potential for a nuclear race in the Indo-Pacific? So that's more specifically for you, Kei. Who would like to start? So either on the Japan and nuclear race or the Middle East Quad?
Shall I go first? Oh, okay. Please go ahead, Brendan.
I'll take the Middle East Quad question. Look, I'm not sure that I see that the Ukraine war has weakened the Quad per se. Again, I think that the leaders in the four capitals are very clear about what the main issue is, and they view this as an unfortunate sideshow, an unfortunate event. In this, by the way, the sentiment is shared by Beijing. which from what I've read was rather appalled at Russia's actions in Ukraine, thinking that Russia had already really accomplished everything it needed to by massing troops and putting pressure on Ukraine. So that's quite an interesting story. As far as this Quad iteration, India, Israel, the UAE, and the United States, it's an odd proposition, but one that makes sense, I guess, contextually and geopolitically, given the recent Abraham Accords between the UAE and Israel, which led to diplomatic recognition and quite warm ties. The very warm ties India shares with both the UAE and Israel. And so interestingly, the three share warmer ties perhaps right now between each other than they do with Washington. I don't know that the UAE's actions or inactions at the UN Security Council, where it's a non-permanent member this year, are really going to flavor the trajectory of this Quad iteration. I can't really speak to the trajectory in general. I'm a little bit skeptical of how it's going to work and what it's going to do. But I don't think that's going to necessarily have a negative impact on it. I think that unlike a country that has the size and clout and really wants to be considered or should be already considered a great power, the UAE is a small state. It's extremely powerful for its size within its region. But I don't think that the United States would say hold this against the UAE. The UAE was merely really prosecuting what it sees as its national interests. Most importantly, the vote the next day that occurred at the UN Security Council, which was about labeling the Houthi in Yemen as a terrorist group, and it successfully achieved Russia's support for that. Where it wouldn't have likely if it had voted with the United States and others against Russia the previous day. So I think it needs to be contextualized within that. I'll stop there in the interest of time and turn it over to Kay.
Right. On the question of nuclear deterrence, yes, Shinzo Abe has relaunched the debate on the nuclear sharing, and it is certainly related to the growing sense of vulnerability of its own security due to the ongoing war in Ukraine. And there is a doubt, I omitted mentioning the important element in my presentation. There is a doubt on the our partner, security partner, which is the United States, but there is an increasing doubt on the reliability of Japan-US alliance. Of course, it is a reliable partner, but in times of crisis and emergency, does the United States dare to protect Japan over the island of Senkaku? So the question of nuclear deterrence or nuclear sharing is closely related to the growing doubt on the US intention to come to aid of Japan's defense. And former Prime Minister Abe sees a right moment to relaunch this debate. But I think there is a challenge in implementing the nuclear sharing or nuclear capability owned by Japan, because Japan itself positioned or championed the non-nuclear, non-proliferation scheme. And right now we have a Prime Minister Kishida, who is from Hiroshima and who has probably 3 more years to manage Japan's politics and diplomacy. So as long as Kishida is in the Prime Minister's position, we won't probably see the Japan's own nuclear capabilities. And in terms of the nuclear race in the in this region, I think we entered the completely new period of history in which the old NPT system is not working. I consider it.
Thank you very much. We have about 5 minutes, so I'll ask you probably the last two questions for our discussions here. One question which is more at the academic level and one which is more policy oriented. The first one from Asif Shuja, who's a senior research fellow at the Institute, and who's asking more specifically for Ash a question regarding the genesis of the concept of the Indo-Pacific. And Asif was asking if do you know of any historical precedents of such politicization of oceans? Do you know any previous strategy that merged two masses of water like this Indo-Pacific concept does? So that's the question in a nutshell. The idea of is it unprecedented, or can you think of other concepts that also added or aggregated two oceans like this? The other question, which is from Ambassador Georgi Bustin from Hungary, and who's a visiting professor at the Institute, who's specifically looking at the upcoming G20 in Bali with the presidency of Indonesia, with the question which will be occurring next November. And the question from Georgi was, do you think that this event, the G20, and the fact that it is going to happen in Southeast Asia, do you think that this could be the opportunity of lowering the tensions among the different players, and in particular, obviously, between Washington and Beijing, regarding all the tensions, so lowering the tensions in the Indo-Pacific? So, as I said, a question which is more academic oriented and one which is more looking at the upcoming diplomatic agenda. Maybe we should start with Ash, if you have.
Sure.
Yeah.
I'll be quick because I know we've only got a few minutes. Very interesting question. Put me on the spot a bit. I think if we were to look at one body of water, then I'll move on to the combining of two bodies of water. What immediately sprung to mind was the conceptualization of the Atlantic Ocean as a strategic theater in the Second World War. That was very much a Churchill idea about creating that as a theater of war, and I've always been intrigued by that idea. In terms of combining bodies of water into one strategic zone, I can think back to one of the geopolitical thinkers I mentioned, Alfred Mahan, and his efforts to push the United States to open the Panama Canal to combine the Atlantic and the Pacific in order to facilitate the quick movement of the concentration of the US Navy, or the nascent US Navy, from East Coast to West Coast rapidly, and the idea that those two oceans were strategically combined.
I'll take a stab at the last question. I'm going to point out very quickly, though, just fun fact, as far as combining oceans, at least three small seas anyway. Turkey has to deal with the Black Sea, the Aegean, and the Mediterranean, and looks at them as a combined maritime space. So quite interesting as far as that's concerned. Of course, that's miniature, but nonetheless, still a major area to police here. The G20 question happening in Indonesia, very good question. Seeing what bringing all these partners together will result in. I'm not sanguine that things are going to get much better. I believe one of the conundrums of the Quad itself and the Indo-Pacific grouping is who's going to cut a separate piece with China. So the lowering of tensions between Washington and Beijing, for example, doesn't necessarily mean a ratcheting down of tensions between Tokyo and Beijing. And this is something Kay alluded to earlier, worries about the commitment of the United States to Japan, what Japan views as its core national or vital national interests, such as the Senkakus. And so maybe something like that would play out there. But again, I think if anything over the past decade, but certainly over the past 5 years and exacerbated by the pandemic is the association of China as, to put it in bald terms, the problem. I think this has been exacerbated and is commonly held to be true in Delhi, Tokyo, Canberra, and Washington. And so the U.S., as vital a role as it's playing in Ukraine right now, and in working with its partners in NATO to assist it, this in no way, I think, takes away from the primacy of the Indo-Pacific. So that's going to be my roundabout, rather not really an answer.
May I just jump in related to the first question? I think well, I have to thank someone who posed this question. I will make it my own agenda. But as far as I know, there is a Polish-driven 3 sea initiatives, which links Baltic Sea, Aegean Sea, and also Black Sea. So this is another initiative initiated by Poland, but it doesn't come out with a related name like Indo-Pacific. So they will probably come up with a nice, charming geographical concept in the future, but we have to look at it. And I think there is another example of a Euro-Pacific, for example, related to Russia, but it's land and sea notion. It's not a sea and sea notion. So it is a very interesting question that I have to study later on. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And I think you have an idea for your next book here. This will be the end of our talk. Let me thank the 3 of you, Ash, Brendan, and Kay, for the engagement. I can only recommend everyone here to have a look at the book. As I said, it's published by Routledge, Indo-Pacific Strategies, coming soon. Let me also say a few words on our next event that will take place next week on Thursday, the 5th of May. My colleague Clemens Shea will moderate a panel on socio-cultural developments in the UAE, so a country familiar to some of you here. This will be at 8 o'clock Singapore time, 8 o'clock in the evening. On next Thursday. Let me again thank you, our speakers, and also our audience for the questions, and have a nice day or evening depending where you are. Thank you all.